I'd like to present the last piece called To the Frontline. So as we all know, I mean, the first few months of 2020 really unfolded in ways that none of us could have ever imagined. In the midst of all these extraordinary and trying times, I think resilience on personal, regional, and global levels have again and again proven their importance and relevance. So the next piece by Susanna Phe, who unfortunately won't be able to join us this afternoon, she explores how community-based organizations really serve as the first line of defense in response to both natural disasters, but also social and equity challenges. So joining us from Los Angeles is Maria Cabildo, who's a planner and affordable housing developer who's been at the forefront of stabilizing and revitalizing some of LA's most disinvested communities. And most notably, she served as the co-founder and CEO of the East LA Community Corporation between 1995 to 2015. So Maria recently also served as a Loeb Fellow with the GSD during the 2018 to 2019 school year. So with that, I'd like to introduce Maria. Thank you.
Since Susanna is not present at today's event, I will do a quick overview of her article on her behalf. George, can you go to the presentation? Yeah. Susanna's study actually originated in disaster response management when environmental disasters such as Hurricane Harvey or California's multi-year drought occurred. Community-based organizations, CBOs, which focus on affordable housing and economic development, often provide immediate and longer-term assistance to people in the affected communities. In her study, Susanna explores how these groups prepare for and carry out the work, or how the resilient effort can actually affect the structure and management of the organizations themselves. Oftentimes, disaster management is not the core mission for these organizations. However, because the CBOs are grassroots, they have a lot of local expertise, they're well received by the community, so they can actually respond faster than government agencies when it comes to disaster relief works. This study is particularly relevant in today's context of the COVID-19 global pandemic and the recent racial equality movements. And we're very lucky to have Maria joining us to advance this discussion. So Maria, we know that you had a lot of experience in civic engagement and building community power. In light of the current event, can you share with us some valuable lessons that you have learned in the past?
Sure. Thank you again so much to everybody involved in the Harvard Real Estate Review. And I'm so glad that, that there are silver linings even to a pandemic, so I'm able to join you where otherwise it would have been so hard to do. You know, I felt that this ended up being so appropriate to the moment that we're living in right now, and I was really kind of when I reread the article, I realized that I saw many of the things that Susanna had lifted up, actually taking place on the ground in Los Angeles right now, as people are responding to both the pandemic and now the civic movement that has really captured everybody right now. So I guess some of the things that thinking about community power and thinking about lessons from the past, one of the things I shared with George and Dixie when we had our check-in call was that I have the experience of having lived in Los Angeles during the 1992 uprising that took place after the Rodney King verdict. And in 1992, definitely there were this mutual aid networks that sprung up, people out on the street helping to clean and provide assistance, but there weren't as many organizations on the ground working with community residents. And so one of the things that you see, at least in Los Angeles, is that after the 1992 uprising, you see many organizations being founded, including the organization that we founded in 1992. But other organizations like the Community Coalition of South Los Angeles and Institute Struggle, these organizations that have been really effective at moving racial equity and social justice policy in Los Angeles and in California, actually really coming out of and after the 92 unrest. So I think that some of the lessons are that these type of crises can lead to the formation of organizations. They forces folks to become much more formal. Maybe they were an informal network before of friends that came together and did things together on the weekends, and then they decide, because of a crisis, to actually create a much more formal structure in which to have a consistent presence and respond to community needs.
That actually leads me to my second question. Susanna mentioned in her article that this organization typically experience a rapid expansion at the time of the crisis, and then a rapid contraction after the crisis is over. As someone running the organization for many years, what advice would you give to the rulers and people running the organization to efficiently deploy their resources?
I think that one thing, and even this is something that we're holding right here in Los Angeles in response to the pandemic. I now work, after my Loeb Fellowship, I actually shifted the focus of my work from community development and affordable housing into racial equity. And I now work for Advancement Project California as a senior fellow. And Advancement Project California is a civil rights organization. And I worked on a report on the COVID-19 disproportionate impact on communities of color in Los Angeles. And you can actually find that report in racecounts.org /COVID-19. And one of the things that we're holding right now is that there is a need to immediately respond to what you see on the ground, but at the same time, keep an eye towards the kind of systemic change that we need to see. And I think that if organizations are able to do both and hold that complexity of responding to the on-the-ground needs today, but also think about the root causes that have caused some of the crisis, or the what we're seeing on the ground, that's a way of looking forward, and then being able to influence budgets. That's one of the things that Susanna mentioned in her article, right, is that she thought that a way of investing in organizations involved in natural disaster relief was to eliminate, these kind of barriers to government funding and maybe creating direct linkages to government funding to fund these efforts. And I think that, if you're able to build organizing capacity and get people involved to actually influence budgets, that you can resource organizations. In the city of Los Angeles now, the mayor of Los Angeles has committed, and the city council is committed, to reduce the police budget by $120 million and shift that $120 million into Black communities, into youth development programs. So really, by having organizations hold these two things of immediate on-the-ground needs, the long-term changes that need to take place to achieve equity, that you could shift the kind of resources that would fund organizations that could have a long-term presence and impact in communities.
Yeah. And in the events such as the pandemic that we're in right now, how do you think these organizations are effective in helping relieve the situation? And can you talk a little more about the research that you're doing about the disproportionate impact of the pandemic?
Sure. Well, one of the things that I saw immediately, even as obviously the government response in the United States has been inconsistent, and at the federal level, very weak. And so, different states and localities have had to address the pandemic on their own. And there were significant gaps at the beginning. And there were immediate impacts in terms of the economic impacts in communities. I mean, there are, in so many cities, people are severely rent burdened. And so the loss of income had a real impact where people needed to make decisions between rent and food. And so in Los Angeles, what we saw was many organizations that were involved in education reform, after school programs, other type of social service, and also community organizing efforts, suddenly, collecting food and doing direct mutual aid to impacted residents of Los Angeles. So what we've seen in Los Angeles is, again, that these organizations that, you know, had their beginnings after the 1992 uprisings in Los Angeles, playing a very important role in supporting organizations, connecting them to resources and information, including help with basic needs, and then these other more informal mutual aid networks springing into. And I'm assuming that a lot of these groups that were informal before and have become a little bit more formal as they are responding to the crisis, I think that they're likely to become organizations. They're like the next wave of social justice focused organizations and service providers in Los Angeles. So I think we're likely to see founding of some more nonprofits. I know there are a lot of nonprofits that have been impacted by the crisis. I think there's a projection right now that I think possibly in California, 20% of nonprofits have already folded because of the COVID-19 pandemic. But I think there's likely to be more organizations that come from the pandemic. So that's what I've seen, like they've really come in and filled these gaps in government in terms of their ability to provide information and access. And I think what's happened, especially because, you know, the acts of violence perpetuated by police, and of course police are part of government, right? I mean, they are a government agency. I think there's a growing mistrust of government. And just as Susanna says in her paper, community-based organizations and community developers become trusted messengers in the community. And they have relationships with community that government right now, there's growing mistrust of government, and CBOs become just really effective messengers. I think in a crisis situation like natural disaster, as Susanna points to, and then also what we're experiencing right now.